Howdy, students. Welcome to Chapter 11. Let me begin by saying that I know there's a typo in this shirt, so don't hassle me about it, okay? I didn't make it. All right, so far in Chapter 2, we learned that it's getting warmer. In Chapter 7, we learned that it's us. And in Chapter 9, we learned that it's bad. And all along the way, we've talked about how we're sure about these things. So now, we're going to spend most of the rest of the semester on this last point. We can fix it. I don't want anyone getting discouraged about climate change. It's certainly a challenge, but we still have the ability to determine the future we want. But it's not going to fix itself. And there are a lot of people out there who don't want to fix it because they don't particularly like the solutions. We'll talk all about that in the next few chapters. The ultimate decision about what to do about climate change is not a scientific question. Policy decisions also incorporate your values, your views of things like the proper role of government, or how we balance the well-being of people today versus the well-being of future generations, or on what you think the responsibilities rich people have to poor people are. These will combine with science to determine what you think we should do about climate change. Overall, the actions we can take in response to climate change fall into three different categories: adaptation, mitigation, and geoengineering. In this video, we're going to talk about adaptation. Now, adaptation refers to making changes that allow us to live with the impacts of climate change. If sea level rise is flooding your city, adaptive responses would be building a seawall around the city, or elevating the houses in the city, or moving the city to higher ground. Importantly, none of these adaptive responses stop the sea from rising. Rather, adaptive responses seek to figure out how to live with the impacts of a changing climate. It used to be that adaptation was viewed as something to be done later, like a term paper due in 2 months. But as we saw in Chapter 9, the impacts of climate change are here now, so adaptation really can't wait. There's no kicking the can down the road on climate change. Probably the most important advantage of adaptation, though, is that it does not require the intrusion of government into the private lives of individual citizens. If the sea rolls into your living room, you're not just going to sit there and be submerged. You're going to do something. You don't need the government or anyone else to tell you to do something. However, this advantage is overstated. Leaving adaptation up to the individual with no government policy severely limits the types of adaptation that can be undertaken, because effective adaptation requires both large-scale coordination and money. First, many adaptive responses are extremely expensive, more expensive than an individual can afford. Building a seawall is one example. Few individuals or even small groups can afford the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that a seawall costs. So building one almost always requires resources from the government. Reinforcing the levees around New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, for example, was simply too expensive for New Orleans to afford. So the U.S. government paid much of the expenses. Without that government aid, fortifying the levees would have been impossible, and the residents of New Orleans would have had to pursue other ways of adapting, such as abandoning the city. Let's talk about coordination. An individual can't build a seawall. A seawall is a large-scale infrastructure project that requires an entire community to decide to build it. That requires government actions to make decisions that have broad support from the community and to organize and pay for the construction. So if we want effective adaptation, the government will be involved. And there are lots of things the government can do to enhance adaptation. Governments can provide climate projections, impact studies, and response assessments. Basically, by telling people that bad things are coming and people should start preparing now. Simply by providing information, governments can be very effective at motivating appropriate behavior. Governments can also use their regulatory authority to require citizens to reduce vulnerability. For example, changing zoning to restrict buildings in vulnerable areas, like areas they know will flood. Finally, governments can use their own spending and operations to build adaptive capacity directly. For example, the way the federal government and the U.S. military helped Louisiana build flood infrastructure after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. While adaptation can help us live through climate change, the ability to adapt is limited in two ways. First, the ability to adapt decreases as larger and faster climate changes are considered. So it will be easier to adapt to 1 degree Celsius of warming in 100 years than it will be to adapt to 2 degrees Celsius warming in 100 years. Second, the ability to adapt is limited by resources. As we talked about earlier, adaptation takes money, and if you don't have it, then your options to adapt will be limited. This shows warming predicted for the 21st century. For changes in the bottom half of the range predicted for the 21st century, rich, technically advanced societies with strong institutions and social capital can achieve what most citizens would consider successful adaptation. If the warming is extreme, however, in the upper part of the predicted range, then climate change will likely overwhelm adaptive capacity of even the world's richest countries. But for poor countries, the story is different. Many of them have populations that are struggling right now. They may not have enough fresh water or food or shelter in the present climate. These countries don't have the money or political institutions necessary to adapt to any climate change. Any climate change at all will be very, very bad for them. Let's think through the implications of this for a minute. Remember back in Chapter 8, we talked about the IPAT relation. It told us that emissions are proportional to how rich people are, which is the A term. This means that most of the CO2 in the atmosphere was emitted by the rich people in the world. So it is the world's rich who are responsible for most of the climate change we are presently experiencing. The poorest people in the world, who've caused very little climate change, are the ones who are going to get hammered the worst as the climate warms, because they're not rich. Leaving them to fend for themselves in a problem they did not cause is a huge moral challenge that adaptation presents us with. In sum, climate change is already happening, and some amount of future climate change is unavoidable. So adaptation is and will continue to be an essential part of our climate response. For the rich world, relying entirely on adaptation is a risk. If climate change ends up in the lower half of predictions, then we might be okay. But if it ends up in the upper end, even the world's richest countries might not have the adaptive capacity to respond appropriately to out-of-control climate change. For the world's poor, the outcome is much more certain. They don't have the financial or institutional resources to adapt to anything. Almost any level of climate change will be a disaster for them. Considering these challenges, it's clear that adaptation is essential but cannot be the complete response. To limit the changes to which future society must adapt and the harms they will suffer if adaptation is depleted or inadequate, it is also essential to slow and stop climate change. This means mitigation, reducing, eventually eliminating greenhouse gas emissions and other human drivers of climate change. The next video will discuss this challenge. And now, your moment of dog.